Okay, so after a long wait, we finally have the official announcement of the Canon R5 Mark II. And I will be honest, it's a really interesting introduction into the Canon lineup. Some of the stuff it does with the AF and the photo side, I'm actually really excited about. I do want to make another video about that down the road. But I want to answer what I think the first question that comes up with this R5 II. And I want to go kind of in depth to that today. And that is the R5 II a Canon R5C killer? And like most things in life, it's not black and white. I think it's complicated. And I think it's really important if you're in a situation that you're thinking about maybe getting a Canon mirrorless body as doing some video stuff, you need to make that decision. Is it worth investing in the R5 II or the R5C? Oh, hey, and do me one favor, if you find this video useful in any way, shape, or form, go ahead and click that subscribe button. It is so hard keeping a YouTube channel going this day, and your subscriptions are the only thing that keeps this channel going. Now, there is one important caveat before we go into this comparison between the R5 II and the R5C, and that is I'm going to keep this as a video-centric video. I mean, let's be honest, if you're going to be using an R5C, you're getting this for the C. You want that cinema operating system, and you want it as primarily a video camera. I don't think there's any doubt based on the photo specs that have come out on the R5 II that from a photographic perspective, the R5 II is going to be a more powerful photography camera than the R5C. Not that the R5C is a slouch in any way, shape, or form. It's got all the great things of an R5, which is absolutely what I love. But you're going to have to take that into account. Now, to start off on paper, a lot of the specs of these two cameras are very close. Not identical, but there's a lot of things they do very close. For instance, they can both do 8K up to 60 frames per second, and that is RAW, mind you. Now, one big difference between the R5 II and the R5C is while the R5C can shoot 8K 60 RAW, you have to have an external power source to really make sure you're getting that on there. The good thing about the R5 II is you can get 8K 60 frames per second RAW with the internal battery and all that stuff built into it. So this could be something that's important. For me, in reality, let's be honest, shooting 8K 60 frames per second RAW is not really that practical or useful for me as an actual shooter. It's just too big and too cumbersome for me. But that's just my perspective. If you find yourself needing 8K 60 frames per second RAW, then the convenience of maybe the R5 II may make it worth it. But in my opinion, if you're shooting stuff like that anyway, you're probably gonna have an external power source and monitors connected to whatever camera you're using. So I feel like it kind of comes out as a wash, but it is kind of one of the first things you should need to look at. Now the R5S2 also shoots in an SRAW format, which is nice, but remember the Canon R5C also allows you full RAW, RAW LT, and you can export RAW through the HDMI. So the R5C technically does give you some more RAW options, but it doesn't have that SRAW. So I think that's gonna come down to what computer system you're on and which version of RAW you prefer to go. So I think when it comes down to the RAW shooting, this is pretty close to a draw. Now that being said, while RAW shooting is nice, I think most of us will be using cameras like this in a non-RAW format. So I want to look at what I would consider the 4K oversampled in the standard frame rates. And I would say that's from 24 up to 60 frames per second. Now, the good news is both cameras do oversampled 4K up to 60 frames a camera. So you're gonna get a great image quality, gonna take that beautiful 8K sensor, gonna downsample it down into 4K and give you really crisp imagery up to 60 frames per second. Now the R5C has already done this, but now with the R5 II, you can set it to fine mode up to 60 frames per second to get that oversampled video. This is something that is very nice. There's a very distinct difference between the fine mode on the R5 and the normal mode. So I think this is going to be a really great thing. So I think when you get down to the quality between these cameras, the R5C and the R5 II should come out pretty much neck and neck. Okay, now I think both cameras are going to come basically neck and neck if you are a standard frame rate shooter. That's going to be anything from what I would consider 24 to 60 frames per second. If you find yourself going higher than that, if you like to do a lot of high frame rate shooting, I think the R5 II is going to edge out the Canon R5C. Now, both cameras can do 4K up to 120 frames per second. But the reason why I'm going to give the edge to the R5 II in this is because you lose AF tracking in the R5C. In the R5 II, you keep high frame tracking, even up to 120 and even up to 240 frames per second in standard HD mode. That is an very, very big advantage to the Canon R5C. And this really just comes down to a limit, I think, in the Canon Cinema OS that's on the R5C. So if you're someone that finds themselves shooting a lot of real high frames, 120 frames per second and over, I think you're gonna really find that having that AF that you can still maintain in the R5 II is going to be a big advantage over the R5C. If you're someone that doesn't really shoot more than 60 frames per second and it's kind of a novel thing, then I think that doesn't have as much of an advantage. That being said, it's not a complete wash for the R5C because I still prefer the frame rate flexibility I get in the R5C. So for instance, I can dial in basically almost any frame rate I want. If I want to shoot at 72, 96, 48, I can dial all those frame rates here in the Canon R5C, and in the Canon R5, I can basically get what it tells me to do. I can get 60, 100, 120, or 240 frames per second based on those systems and what the frame rate is. The other thing I would point out about the R5 II, it's a brand new camera, and from the first footage that I've seen, it is incredible having the option to shoot at 240 frames per second in 1080, but it still looks like it's a little bit soft. So I think it's going to come out to see, is the R5 II 240 frames per second actually something that's usable professionally, or is it more like a gimmick? I think the verdict's still out. We have to see that. Now, the next thing I want to look at is going to be the low light performance of these cameras. And this is something that, I'll be honest, I was completely shocked that the R5 II does not come with a dual base ISO like the R5C. The R5C has both an 800 and 3200 base ISO. And I'll be honest, this is one of the most useful features of any modern camera these days, having some kind of dual base ISO. It is a feature that I end up using all of the time in the R5C. And I was just completely shocked that they don't introduce this at all in the Canon R5 II. Now I know there's a new sensor on the R5 II that may allow us to just kind of naturally reach up there, but I don't think it's going to be quite as clean as having a dual base ISO. Now, even if the R5 II has an unofficial dual native ISO like the R5, for instance, the R5 doesn't have an official dual native ISO, but you do see a noise cleanup at 3200, I still have to give this advantage to the R5C. Having a dual base native ISO, especially of 800 and 3200, is so practical and so useful on a camera like this that I would give a huge advantage to the Canon R5C if you're going to find yourself in situations where you have tougher light situations, especially if you're doing a lot of documentary work where you may be struggling to get every ounce of light you can get. Now, all that being said, once we get a production model of the R5 II, we'll see if this is really true, but my initial response is the R5C is going to win, at least before we get these things in our hands and can actually do a true apples to apples comparison. Now, another part of any camera system that you've got to cover nowadays is going to be the autofocus system of the cameras. And one thing about this, because the Canon R5 II is not a Cinema OS system, the AF systems in these cameras are very, very different. Now, all the Canon autofocus systems nowadays are pretty darn good, to be honest, especially in interview and basic situations like that. But I gotta be honest, I still feel that the R5 lines of AF works better in video mode than the R5C. I'm talking about the R5 I. I still trust the AF more than I do in the Cinema OS autofocus mode in the R5C. And that means that I'm pretty darn sure that what I've seen in the autofocus release of the R5 II is just going to completely blow the R5C autofocus out of the water. I don't think there's a real doubt about that, seeing the R5 I pretty much already destroys it. So I'm pretty sure the R5 II is going to get you a more robust autofocus. Now, does that matter if you're shooting cinema stuff with the R5C? Absolutely not. I think this can really cover most cinema-based things. But if you find yourself being a lot of gimbal work, a lot of run and gun work where you need fast autofocus in chaotic situations, the R5 II probably is going to be better for you in that situation. You just need to figure out where you're going to find yourself shooting more. However, that being said, there is still one area of autofocus that I think the R5C still has a leg up, and that's in its face-only mode detection. detection. And what that means is I'm doing face-only mode detection, I can have the camera track a face, and if a person steps off camera, the camera's not going to hunt and look and focus on the background. It's going to stay there until a face comes in. It's actually an extremely useful feature. I haven't seen if they're going to have something like that in the R5 II. I hope they do. But it is something that's very useful, especially if you're a cinema type shooter. Now, the next thing you have to look at if you're comparing these two cameras and is the R5 II truly an R5C killer is going to be the power situation. Now, the R5C is notorious for its terrible battery life, and a lot of that comes down to with how the Cinema OS actually reads the battery more than the battery itself. And because of all that and the OS and all that, I really have no doubt that the R5 II, with its new battery that's coming with it, is going to have a better power performance for video things. If you're just going to have to rely on one internal battery, I'm pretty much going to say the R5 II probably will give you much better performance, just like the R5 gives you much better video performance than the R5C. Now, that being said, if it comes down to power, and that's the one thing that's putting you on the fence between these two cameras, I will say it is extremely easy to power the R5C with an external battery source, like, so for instance, I just have a little V-mount up here. I'll slip a little V-mount brick up there, power with USB-C, and once you do something like that, the power consumption on the R5C actually works great. It's actually, you can go forever on one V-mount battery. You just got to realize if you need internal batteries, that's where the issues come in. So that's just something to consider. Now, the next thing that I think you need to look at if you're thinking is the R5 II and R5C killer is working with other cinema cameras in the cinema line. For instance, you're not going to use these cameras a lot as standalone cameras. I mean, you will a lot, but a lot of times you're going to bring these in together with other cameras like the C500, the C70, you name it. So you want a camera that's going to coexist in those ecosystems very easy. And I really still feel that with the codecs and the Cinema OS of the R5C, that this is still the ideal companion and B-cam for the Canon cinema line. Like I said, 300, the C70, C500, you name it. I still feel the R5C does have the advantage here in dropping in with those other camera systems. But I will say this is a super close call, because now with the inclusion of C-Log2, which even the Canon R5C doesn't have, and XFAVCS and XFHEC in the R5 II, that means that even though you don't have the cinema operating system, you can still record in what I would consider cinema codecs on the R5 II. So I think now this becomes a very close call. Really smart move by Canon in giving us those cinema codecs inside the R5 II. Makes it really, I think, a great B-cam. So if I had to choose, probably go with the R5C, but the R5C can't do C-Log2. So it's just a really tight call for that, and it's something you need to be aware of. Now, let's talk about one area where the R5C definitely struggles, and the R5 II is going to take it out behind the woodshed and just spank it, and that is going to be on Wi-Fi and Bluetooth control. Now, there's really no competition whatsoever in this situation, because for whatever reason, the Canon R5C has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built into the body, but you can only ever access it in photo mode. You can't access it in the Cinema OS and video mode unless you put a $1,000 adapter on the bottom of the camera. The R5 II should be able to access all the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth natively in the camera. So right there, if you're someone that needs Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, I would say that the R5C gets destroyed by the R5 II. Now, if you're doing video, monitoring is going to actually become a very important aspect of your camera system. And I still feel like the Cinema OS on the R5C is still a bit more practical. But I gotta admit, the R5 II has really made it close now that it's going to allow us to have waveform and false color on these cameras. Now, I have seen a lot of release from Canon about the R5 II. I've seen the waveform. I haven't seen any false color, but it is listed on the specs. And I think that's something that is going to be important. So now I think the monitoring situation is going to be very close. And then really the last thing I think you have to do when you're comparing the new R5 Mark II and this R5C, we got to talk about value, because I think that's the last thing you need to factor in if you're considering about purchasing one of these two cameras. Now, I was personally a bit surprised that the Canon R5 II came in at $4,300 versus the $3,600 of the R5C. And this is a $700 difference between these two cameras. And you gotta ask yourself if all the advantages of the R5 II, do that equal that extra $700? Or should you get an R5C and save the $700 and maybe buy a better lens and something like that, or start saving up for a lens? And it's a really hard call. It's a really, really hard call. And I think it really comes down to what your needs are. I don't think there's any one answer. Is the Canon R5 II, like R5C Killer? Well, it can be, but then there are other times when I would still grab an R5C over the R5 II. So I think if you're someone that's primarily looking for like a solid B cam to fill in work with other cinema cameras, or you find yourself mostly shooting like typical situations, like 24 frames per second, then I personally think, based on the value and all that stuff, the Canon R5C is still the way to go. Most realistic cinema situations, interviews, things like that are going to be really, really benefited by having an R5C. I don't think a lot of the advantages you'll see in the R5 II are really going to make that big a difference if you find yourself doing that as your primary form of work. However, if you find yourself doing a lot of solo shoots where you need that AF, or you need a lot of the variable frame rates that you need for like more dynamic B-roll or, you know, fast solo work, then I think that that extra autofocus, because you don't have someone checking your work, or it's just the situation's more dynamic and you need that much more flexibility and range from your camera, then the R5 II could be the tipping point. So it really comes down to what you need and what you're looking for. But anyway, guys, it's a hard call, and it's been a really, really interesting thing to look at. Hopefully this helps you make some kind of decision as you go out there. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. Leave me notes and comments down below. And yeah, I'd rather keep on shooting, and yeah, I'll talk to you soon.